Welcome everyone to this webinar. We are delighted to be hosting this on behalf of the Partnership for America's Children, Kids Count, Count All Kids, and the other leadership of the Count All Kids network is First Focus, 0 to 3, and the Coalition on Human Needs. I want to kick us off by mentioning a couple of things and then turn this over to Mark. First of all, this research is, the topic of this webinar is based on critical research that Mark and others at PRB did along with Bill O'Hare to try and identify which children are most at risk of being missed in the census. And Bill O'Hare has been a critical seminal figure in all of our work on trying to get young kids counted. So I wanted to acknowledge him at the start of the webinar. Secondly, we've tried to invite a very broad swath of the census advocacy community to this webinar. And we've done that because some of the other tools that are out there to help you identify where young children are, where people in general are at risk of being missed in the census, are not the best tools for identifying where kids are going to be missed. Specifically, the other tools are typically based on the self-response rates to the census in 2010. How many people responded on their own versus had to be approached by the census. That may be a great approach for adults. It generally is. But we know from other research that even when adults fill out the form, they often leave young kids off. And so what that means is that the self-response rate by itself may miss a lot of communities where people fill out the form but don't include their young children, and as a result, young children don't get counted. The work that PRB and Bill O'Hare did was intended to identify the communities where kids are specifically most at risk. And we're hoping that this research that we're delighted to share with you today will help you design your local outreach strategies in a way that includes communities where the adults in your community may be at less risk of being missed, but the kids are at very high risk. And so this may define a broader and different set of advocacy target communities for you than if you just relied on things like the hard to count map. So having said that, I am really thrilled to be able to introduce Mark Mather, who did the original research on identifying which kids are at risk of being missed and is now using that research to identify where response rates are lagging for kids. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you. And thank you so much for doing this today.
Great. Thank you, Deb. And thanks everybody for joining. I know census is not necessarily top of mind for a lot of people right now, but in some ways I feel like it's more important than ever. We know it's the most disadvantaged neighborhoods and kids living in those places that are most likely to have a risk of an undercount, and also most in need of federal funds. So many of you have been keeping track of the weekly reports that have been coming out of the City University of New York, the hard to count map. And I thought I would start just to provide some context. This is the hard to count map for the most recent period. I think it's from June 2nd for Washington, DC, where PRB is located. And it looks like a lot of other cities around the country, I think, where there's a lot of neighborhoods that are doing very well. And then there tends to be this cluster of neighborhood census tracts where things are not going so well. In the case of DC, it's 16th Street, kind of divided right down the middle of the city, that kind of divides areas that have higher response rates in blue and those that have lower response rates in orange and yellow. So today I'm going to talk about a new resource to help you pinpoint those areas that are falling behind, and specifically, as Deb mentioned, those areas that are at high risk of an undercount of young children. I want to just I have a few acknowledgements before I start. I want to thank my PRB colleagues, Linda Jacobson, Alicia Van Orman, Matthew Martinez. All of us have been working over the past 2 or 3 weeks to put all these materials together. And I want to thank the Annie Casey Foundation. I know Flo, I can see Flo's on the webinar today. The Annie Casey Foundation is providing funding for this most recent project. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provided funds for the initial work that we had done with Bill O'Hare on kids living in very high-risk census tracts. I want to thank the Partnership for America's Children for hosting this webinar and for making these materials available on their website. And then again, Bill O'Hare just for kind of leading the way. His work has really set the stage for everything that I'm showing you today. So here's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to start with some of the background on how we arrived at this point. We are building on PRB's database on the undercount of young children that we released initially in February of 2020, so a couple months ago. And then I'm going to talk about this new resource where we are really targeting areas for 2020 census outreach based on communities where there's a very high risk of undercounting young children, combined with areas that have low 2020 census self-response rates. Then I'll review some of the tables that we've made available, a new database, and go through some interactive maps. So if you can stick through this to the end, I think the maps may be what people are going to be most interested in. We started this work for a few different reasons. First of all, we know that young children, those are kids under age 5 in this case, that are more likely to be missed in the census than any other age group. So in 2010, the net undercount rate for children under age 5 was approaching 5%, which is much higher than adults and older adults, for example. Second, previous studies on why children are missed has mostly been descriptive. So we took more of an analytical approach, which was something that others had not done previously, and it allowed us to, I think, kind of present some findings that hadn't been shown before. And then third, the Census Bureau, although they've done a lot of outreach efforts focused on local areas, so they are producing regularly, they're releasing these response rates at the tract level. They've released undercount rates for sub-state levels, but they don't publish undercount rates for children for small geographic areas. So that really was the motivation for us doing this work. So we conducted an analysis to identify the key factors that were predicting net undercount rates for young children in 2010. We then produced a new tract level risk measure of net undercount for young children. And we included that risk measure in a database along with key factors associated with the child undercount. All of those materials are available on PRB's website. So this is just a screenshot of the article. There's also a link at the very bottom there in very small font. But I think many of you have also seen these data through Steve Romoleski's map, the hard to count map at the City University of New York. So he has also mapped these very high risk tracts through his mapping application at the City University of New York. The broader goal here is really to help advocates better pinpoint the neighborhoods that are with the greatest risk of undercounting young children in the 2020 census. And we want to also identify racial ethnic composition of these areas. So I know that that's top of mind for a lot of people, especially right now. So in the previous database and the database that I'm showing today, we do have information about racial ethnic composition of kids. And then to better understand the tract level factors that have put kids at risk of being missed in the past, and hopefully enabling you to design better, more effective outreach efforts for the 2020 census. The data sources for this earlier work, the first one's a little bit of a mouthful, but this is what the Census Bureau had provided to us. It's the revised 2018 Experimental Demographic Analysis, or DA estimates. It consists of 689 large counties in those are counties with at least 5,000 children under age 5 in the 2010 census. And then along with, for those counties, they provided to us net undercount rates for kids under age 5 for 2010. We combine those data in a series of models with American Community Survey data, specifically 5-year estimates, mostly from the 2013 to 2017 ACS. We also incorporate some 2014 to 2018 data to look at total number of kids under age 5 and their racial ethnic composition. And then we've also incorporated some 2010 census data, such as the male return rate, into our models. Some of you are probably asking, why are we focusing on the 689 counties? There's over 3,000 counties nationwide, and I realize that this is somewhat limiting. It means that we don't have data for more rural areas, certain small towns, lots of small towns, American Indian reservations, and there certainly are lots of communities at risk in those smaller counties. But these are the data that the Census Bureau provided to us, so we didn't have access to data for the other counties. And I think the reason they didn't provide those data is that the undercount rates for those smaller counties are probably much less reliable. So these are probably the best data to work with anyway, given the issues we might have for smaller areas. It's also the case that these counties accounted for about 93% of the national net undercount of young kids in the 2010 census. So we should be covering most of the kids who are at risk across the country. And although it's only 689 counties, it includes a large number of tracts. So our original database had about 57,000 census tracts. That's out of a total of about 74,000 tracts nationwide. If you look across all of these counties, the net undercount rate for kids under age 5 was about 4.4% in 2010. But the results show that the undercount rates are highest in the most populous counties. So I've highlighted that. I've kind of put that in red here on this chart. You can see that for counties with at least 1 million or more people, the net undercount rate of young children was 6.2%, so much higher than the average across all of the counties. And then for counties with less than 250,000 people, it drops down to 2.4%. So there's a big difference there, and it kind of reinforces or supports us just using these data for larger counties in the country. For our county level analysis, we looked at 40 potential measures across 6 different domains. So racial and ethnic composition, socioeconomic status, family structure and living arrangements. We had some other demographic measures. We looked at housing variables such as renters, and then response rates from the 2010 census. We then pared down this list to focus only on those variables that had a stronger association. We looked at correlation analyses and determined those that had a stronger association with the undercount of young children. And then we, again, only focused on those that weren't strongly correlated with each other. For modeling purposes, that's important because it eliminates multicollinearity in our models. So through this process, we were able to reduce our model to 21 potential explanatory variables. I mentioned that we use regression models for our analysis. We actually developed separate regression models. So we had some that focused, we had one model just for those counties with 250,000 or more people, separate model for smaller counties, And the reason we did that is because we did determine that the factors associated with young child undercount seem to be a little bit different for those larger and smaller areas. We used a stepwise process then where we would add variables, delete variables until we had the best fitting model that we could get. And that resulted in a final model with 7 key variables. And those 7 key variables we found explained 52% of the variation in net undercount of young kids across these counties. So about half of the variance was explained. That is significantly better than if you had just used something like the 2010 mail return rate, which is the data that we had previously, which only explained about 17% of the variance. Or if you look at the percent of children living in hard to count tracts, you explain about 20% of the variance. So we were encouraged that our model was doing a better job, at least in terms of measuring this variance. These are the 7 variables that we came up with for identifying the variables that were most closely associated with young child undercount. So it's things like poverty rate, educational attainment, children living in female-headed households, children living in grandparent households, limited English-speaking households, children in immigrant families, and people living in renter-occupied households. These variables lined up pretty well with previous research showing that socioeconomic status and complex family structure and nativity status are associated with children being missed. Okay, so then we turn to the tract-level analysis. After the county level work, we had these coefficients that we could then apply at the tract level to produce tract level predicted net undercount rates for young children. So we did this for all of the tracts within these large counties. We then classified tracts into 3 risk categories based on the predicted net undercount rates for children under age 5. So very high risk tracts were those, we classified those as having rates of net undercount rates of 8.3% or higher. And that accounted for about 25% of tracts. High risk tracts were those with rates between 0% and 8.29%. And then low risk tracts were those with less than 0, so a predicted net undercount of children under age 5. And here's the national summary table of those results. So out of about 16.5 million children under age 5, 4.1 million, again, that's the row that's boxed in red there. 4.1 million children under age 5 were classified as living in very high risk tracts. The line right above that shows that another 9.3 million young kids are in high-risk tracts, and then a smaller number, 3 million, are in the low-risk or potential overcount tracts. We also found that Black and Latinx children were much more likely to be living in these very high-risk tracts or neighborhoods compared with other racial ethnic groups. So almost half of Black children, 48%, were living in census tracts classified as having a very high risk of undercount. The number for Latinx young children was 38%, which is obviously much higher than the rate for non-Hispanic white young children at 9%. These very high-risk tracts have other characteristics that kind of set them apart. So looking across our 7 key variables, you can see that across the board, these tracts have much higher percentages of children and households that are exhibiting these different characteristics. So poverty, young adults with less than a high school diploma, children living in female-headed households. If you look at households that are limited English speaking, you can see that the rates are more than double for those tracts that have a very high risk of undercounting young children. So we put these variables into our database so that you can see these percentages along with the response rates and the risk of undercounting young children. So Deb, should I pause here to see if there are any questions? I'm about to enter phase 2 of this presentation. I don't know if you want to wait until the end for questions or if there's any burning questions that people had right now.
Hi. I think we've had a couple of questions that are not directly part of what you're talking about and that I'm answering in the Q&A. So I think we'll wait for the questions for you until the end of the presentation. So go ahead.
Okay. All right, let me see where I was here. Okay, so for part 2, I'm going to briefly describe the work we're doing now at PRB with support from the Casey Foundation. And the key message here is really that 2020 self-response rates are lowest in those neighborhoods that have a very high risk of undercounting young children. So if you look at the column here in this table showing the average self-response rate, it was 60% across all of the tracts in the United States on May 28th. But if you look at if you compare that with the rows that are shaded blue here, you can see that there's variation based on the risk of undercount in those tracts. So that response rate is 68% for tracts that we've classified as having a low risk of undercounting young children. It's 66% for tracts with a high risk of, 63% for tracts with a high risk of undercount. And then it drops all the way to 54% for those tracts with a very high risk of child undercount. So maybe it's not that surprising that we see this pattern, but I think it means that it really is worth taking a closer look at those tracts that are in this high risk, very high risk category, because those seem to be the tracts that they're kind of doubly disadvantaged across these two measures. The second column in this chart shows the average percentage point change in response rates during the week prior to May 28th. So it's basically showing is the response rate improving over time and how quickly is it doing so? And it actually shows the opposite pattern. So it's the very high risk tracts that show the most improvement over the previous week. And we had to think about this a little bit because it was a little bit counterintuitive, but I think it shows that these tracts are starting from such a low level in a sense that it's easier for them to show more progress. So the gap is slowly closing between these different neighborhoods, but at the rate they're going, it's going to take a long, long time to close this gap completely. We also looked at data across counties. So on the left of this slide it shows the 20 counties that had the most young children living in very high-risk neighborhoods, the most in terms of the absolute number of kids living in very high-risk neighborhoods. And so Los Angeles County is at the top with almost 300,000 young kids living in very high-risk tracts. There's a lot of counties here represented from California, Texas, New York, large metropolitan areas in those states. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the 2020 self-response rates for these 20 counties. And it shows that for all of the top 10 counties, the 10 largest counties in the right-hand side, they all have self-response rates that are below the national average. So I've shaded those counties, sorry, not below the national average, below the average response rates in tracts in these 689 counties in our database. It gets a little bit confusing. But those that are shaded red are those that are below that, that large county average, and those that are shaded green are those that are doing a little bit better than the average across all the tracts. So the county that's actually doing the best here is Santa Clara, which is the San Francisco Bay Area. That's at 70% shaded green. The one that's doing the worst out of these 20 counties is Hidalgo County in South Texas, which is at 44%. If you then rank the counties by the share of children living in very high-risk neighborhoods, that's what we've done on this chart, you'll notice that there are actually several counties that were on the previous slide that are also represented here. So that includes Miami-Dade County, Hidalgo, Philadelphia, Queens, the Bronx, El Paso, and Broward. So those are significant because it means they not only have a large share of kids living in these high-risk areas, but also a very large number of kids who are at risk, or potentially at risk because they're living in these neighborhoods. In all of these 20 counties, at least half of the young kids are living in high-risk neighborhoods. And so in Starr County at the top here, it's close to 100% of kids living in very high-risk neighborhoods. And at the lowest, it's still more than half in Cumberland County, New Jersey at 55%. You can also see that many of the self-response rates are quite low for these counties on the right-hand side here. So all of the 20 counties have response rates that are below the average across all of the tracts. And some of them are quite low. So for Apache County, Arizona, the current response rate, the latest response rate is 3.3%. It is low there, but I think they're starting from a different place because it's such a rural area. They're in what the Census Bureau calls an update leave area. So those are most households in Apache County probably have not received notification through the mail about filling out their form. Instead, it might just be this week that they're receiving their forms to fill out, and many of them may not have even received their forms yet. So they're starting from a different baseline than some of these other areas. Okay, so that gives you a sense of some of the data that we're producing under this project. This is a list of all of the detailed files that we are producing, and I'm not going to just go through this. I'm not just going to read this slide because I think it'll be easier for me to just show you what these different products are, and I'm going to do that in a minute. But I do have to note there's one methodological note I need to mention, which is that the 2020 self-response rates are only available for the new 2020 census tract boundaries. So I mentioned earlier that there are about 74,000 tracts in the country. Well, that's based on the 2010 boundaries. For the 2020 census, there's now about 84,000 tracts. So, and the data that the Census Bureau is providing on response rates are for those new tract boundaries. So we had to make some adjustments because our undercount database is based on the 2010 census tracts, and they didn't line up with these new tracts. So the basic procedure was that we allocated our 2013 to 17 ACS data from the 2010 boundaries to the 2020 boundaries based on the share of housing units in the 2010 tracts that are located in the new 2020 tracts. So we went through that process. We recalculated our estimates for those 7 key variables. And then we needed to rerun our model based on the 2020 tracts, list of tracts. We think that the effects overall should be relatively minor. And for those tracts with boundaries that haven't changed, there really isn't any effect at all on the data. Okay, so now I am going to, let me see if I can change the view here to focus on our online materials. Okay, Deb, can you see my Excel file there?
Yes, I can.
Great. So there's a series of tabs in this Excel file, and these are all posted on the Count All Kids website now. We have a summary profile, which is in the first sheet here. This is also available as in PDF format. So this includes that national table that I showed you previously. It also includes those county level results for the largest numbers and shares of children living in very high-risk census tracts. And I should mention this Excel file and all of these materials we're going to be updating all of these on a weekly basis. So as the Census Bureau updates their response rates, we're going to be revising all of these files and making them available. The plan is to update these materials every Monday, at least through sometime in July. It could be twice monthly, a little bit later in the summer. So that's the response profile. That's the summary profile. We've got the national level table here. And then we have two county level tables. So the first one is ranked by the number of young children living in very high-risk census tracts. So it was the basis for those county data I was showing earlier with Los Angeles County shown at the top. In this file, we've got all of the 689 counties in our database. We're showing the total child population, the number of children under age 5 living in very high-risk census tracts, the share of kids living in very high-risk census tracts, then the average response rate in those tracts, and then some information about the percentage point change in response rates during the previous week. So you can see that those response rates are not moving by leaps and bounds. It's from one week to the next. It looks like generally there might be a 0.5 percentage point change in those response rates for most tracts, most counties. Then we show the average response rate across a very high risk census tracts, and parallel measure on the average percentage point change in response rates across the very high risk census tracts. So as I mentioned, this county table is repeated. This is the same exact table, but instead of sorting by the number of children living in very high risk tracts, this one's sorted by the share of children living in very high risk tracts. And then finally, we have a tract level database, and this is a large file. So we've got 84,000 rows in this file, one for each census tract in the new, based on the new 2020 census boundaries. And it's easier to see what's in this sheet by going to the codebook. So there's a sheet here with the codebook that shows what all of these variables represent. And so what we have here is some basic information about the geographic identifiers. We have information on the undercount risk category, the 2020 census response rate, percentage point change in the response rate during the previous week, and then some demographic information, not just total number of children, but also the number of children in different racial ethnic groups. So we have not had a chance to really study this database closely or conduct much of an analysis on it, but we think that these racial ethnic data in particular could be very useful to folks in targeting resources, targeting areas for your outreach efforts. And then finally, we've got information about those 7 key variables, the percent of children and households with various characteristics. So that is the Excel file. I am now going to try to switch gears again and try to share a different screen.
Mark, before you
Yes,
do that,
yeah,
we have a comment that I think you might want to just show right now.
sure.
Amy Swan from Kentucky says it might be helpful for you to quickly show folks how to filter the tract level tab by state to quickly see the data for their communities. Is that something you want to take a moment and do?
Yes, I can. So you can filter these data. Um, Up at the top here, one of the Excel options is to sort and filter. So you can do a custom sort here. You can pick the variable of interest. So if you wanted to pick a geography of interest, you would just select that state or county or tract that is of interest, and then you can just filter for those variables that are of interest. Actually, I pick sort here rather than filter, but the filter button gives you an option to select and deselect any state or other geographic area that might be of interest. Okay. Okay, so there is a new web article. All of this information was actually posted on Count All Kids website today, so you are the first to see these materials. There's a short landing page here targeting areas to improve the count of young children in the 2020 census. We provide a link here to the original PRB analysis that we did with Bill O'Hare. And then if you scroll down, there's a link to the detailed tables. Well, actually, there's a folder you will come to. So the plan is to produce different folders for each week as we update all of these materials. There will be a new folder. This one is for May 28th, and then we'll be adding folders as we add additional data. But if you open this folder, that's where you can find the tables that I just showed you. There's a PDF of that summary profile, and then there's a series of maps, which is what I'm going to show you as the last piece of this webinar. And so as you go to these maps, you'll see that they are labeled so that hopefully you can easily find the data for your state. So we've put the state postal codes in here. For kind of less populated states, there's a lot of states covered in a single map. For California, for Florida, they each get their own map. And the reason we've got 11 separate files here is because we determined that just having one single map file was going to be too unwieldy. The file size was too large, so we had to split them up. So this is the map for California. And let me see. There's a legend here at the bottom that shows you what these different colors mean. So the top category are those census tracts that have a very high risk of undercount combined with a below average response rate. And in terms of below average in this case means it's below 62%, which is the average across tracts in those 689 large counties. So this particular view isn't all that useful, but if you can zoom in and you'll get a much clearer picture of what these look like for more densely populated areas. So this is the San Francisco Bay Area. So you can click on any of these tracts to get the basic information. So it shows you the tract FIPS ID. It shows you that, yes, in fact, it's a very high risk of undercounting young children, so that it's coded with that red shading. It shows you the 2020 census self-response rate, and it shows you the total number of children ages 0 to 4. The tracts that are shaded orange here are those that had a high risk of child undercount combined with a lower response rate. So we think that especially maybe in smaller metropolitan areas, there may be fewer in that red category, and you may be paying more attention to some of those in this next category. Those that are shaded in a lighter color orange are those with a low risk of child undercount or potential overcount combined with a lower response rate. And then the tracts that are shaded blue are those that have a higher response rate. So those that represent 62% or higher response rate in those tracts. Let's see. I do have all of the maps lined up here. I won't have time to go through them all. You'll notice that there's a lot of white space on a lot of these, and that's because, again, we're just focusing on the 689 tracts with at least 5,000 children. So you really do need to zoom in to get the data for your areas of interest. This is the map for the Seattle area. Hawaii and Alaska are also included on this map with some of the states in the Pacific Northwest. This is a large collection of states, mostly in the Mountain West and the Midwest. So there weren't as many data points for these areas, so we've got a lot of states included in a single map. Here's Minnesota, which is in Minneapolis, which is interesting because Minneapolis does have one of the highest response rates in the country, but even there, if you zoom in, you can see that there are parts of Minneapolis that have a very high risk of child undercount and relatively low response rates. Here's parts of Appalachia, Indiana, and Ohio. Texas has its own map. You can see there's a lot more orange and red in Texas, so there seem to be a lot more areas in parts of the South that are really lagging. Here's some more states in the South. Florida. This is the Mid-Atlantic region and then stretching down to the Carolinas. So in Washington, D.C., the data really line up pretty closely with what I had shown you earlier in Steve Romoleski's map. And you can really see that east-west divide in DC. This is a zoomed in, I was interested in seeing my mom just got her census form this week. So she actually lives in one of those update leave areas. So I checked this map just to confirm that, yes, in fact, the small town where I grew up, Mount Gretna, Pennsylvania, is shaded in this as having a low response rate. And it makes sense because she's in a very rural area, and you know, here's Mount Gretna. It's a very rural area, so they just haven't, because of the delays with the pandemic, they just haven't reached those communities yet. And then finally, here's a map of the northeastern states. So from a distance, again, it looks like most of New England's doing pretty well, but if you zoom into Boston, you can get a much better picture of these high-risk areas. And you can click on any of these tracts. You can see here's a tract in Boston with a response rate of about 50%. Whereas if you go out to these outer suburbs, here it is at 86%, 72%. So it's much higher in the surrounding areas. And you see this pattern in a lot of cities I noticed where kind of central city areas, you have a lot of these dark red shaded areas. Then there tends to be an area around them in blue in the suburbs and outer suburbs. Then you get closer to the exurbs and rural areas, and it tends to turn on again. So that seems to be a familiar pattern. I'm going to stop there just to allow time for questions. I want to mention that I would treat this as a beta release. We did put all of these materials together very quickly, just in the past 2 or 3 weeks. So we are open to making changes to these materials, adding additional data to the database that I showed you. If there are suggestions for any improvements, please let us know, because as I said, we're going to be producing these materials on a weekly or twice monthly basis, so we can make those changes as needed as we go along. So thank you.
Great. So I'm going to take a moderator's privilege and ask a question, and then we do have several in the Q&A, and I encourage everybody to go ahead and post more questions in the Q&A. But my question for Mark right now is there an easy way for people who are just interested in the communities with large numbers of, say, Black kids at risk of being missed, to go back and sort the file to show those?
Yes, so the tract-level database, we have columns for the number of kids within each racial ethnic group, the number of Black kids, Latinx kids, all of the major racial ethnic groups. So if you are, if we were going to do that kind of analysis at PRB, we would probably read the file into SAS or SPSS using the code book. But for those who don't have statistical software, you should be able to use those formulas, the Excel formulas and filters. I'm not that skilled in using Excel for that kind of analysis, but you should be able to use that kind of filtering to pull out the data for, if there's a particular threshold of racial ethnic composition, percent minority, percent Black, and so on, you should be able to do that.
Okay, so before we start talking about your research in general, there's been some give and take in the Q&A about the use of administrative data in 2010. I just want to double check. My understanding is that in 2010, the Bureau did not use administrative data to actually collect the census data, although they did use some of it afterwards to try and figure out how accurate their count was. Is that your understanding? And Bill O'Hare may want to put in an answer either in the Q&A or the chat box as well.
Yeah, that's my general sense too. I'm not an expert on how administrative data were used in the 2010 census, but I know that they've been using more administrative data kind of on the fly to help with their efforts this time to reduce costs and to identify vacant homes and things like that. So it's a bigger part of the effort for 2020, but still, there's still a lot of talk about, people ask, why do we even need a census if we've got all of these administrative data from tax records and so on? But I think most agree that there is no substitute for these kinds of data that we're collecting from the census. So it's useful to supplement and to help with the collection efforts, and potentially to fill in some of the missing data and verify missing data, but no substitute.
So then the question that kind of raised this was, is the child undercount rate of 4.4% after the use of administrative data? And I think you've answered that, but what I wanted to amplify there is that that's a net undercount. So that includes both kids who were missed, which was actually a much higher rate, and then they subtract from that kids who were double counted for various reasons, like kids who have, separated parents and they both count the kid. You want to confirm or amplify?
Yes, right. It's mostly, you're exactly right that it's mostly that calculation of kids who are missed versus and kids who are double counted. There's some other cases where a little more technical that reasons for kids being missed. But I will mention that the demographic analysis data that are used to produce these net undercount rates, there have been questions about the accuracy of those data, but as Bill O'Hare has mentioned in his previous work, the data for young kids is thought to be pretty good in terms of those birth records that we have that are used to produce these demographic analysis data. Because we don't have to factor in all of the other. It's mostly birth data that are important there, and we have pretty good birth data for that purpose.
And just to clarify, we don't use the birth data to reach the census counts. We use it to check whether they're accurate or not. I do want to highlight for people that 4.4% of young kids is almost 1 million young kids. It's a very high number no matter how you look at it, which is why Count All Kids is doing as much as we can to make sure we do a better count in 2020. We then have a very technical question from Rodolfo Gutierrez saying, is the 3.3 response rate for Apache County correct?
Yes, I think it's probably correct. We've seen, if you look through the tract-level database, we did find there were a lot of tracts that had extremely low response rates. I mean, most of them are not like that, but there were quite a few that some had 0 response rates. And we do think that most of those are in kind of unique types of places, or, I looked at a couple of them. One looked like it was in the Grand Canyon, right next to the Grand Canyon. One was an island off the coast of Panama City, Florida. I think it's places that are not reached through traditional means, and so they're classified in these update leave areas where instead of getting something in the mail, somebody comes to your door and leaves you a packet, and that's like what my mom received at her door earlier this week. So that update leave process has been lagging because of the pandemic, and I think that helps explain those very low rates.
And for those who haven't been following update leave, and there's a small group that's called Update Enumerate where they come and check the housing and then actually do the enumeration, got put on hold because of the pandemic. They have been slowly reopening individual areas for that process as it becomes safe because of the pandemic. So if you're in one of those counties with a very low rate, it's really worth going back and checking in, say, 2 weeks. Once an area is opened, I'm told it typically takes about 2 weeks to leave all the census packets. Bill O'Hare, our hero of this project, is beside you, Mark, asks which data will be available on the PRB website versus the Count All Kids website.
Right now, we've only provided the data on the Count All Kids website, and I should probably bring up that link here.
I think Jasmine posted it in the chat.
Okay, great. So we do plan to post these materials also on PRB's website as well, but as I said, we just got these data up today on the Count All Kids website, and we hope to conduct some more analysis also, especially looking at some of the racial ethnic composition data and how that, I think it would be useful to not only know the areas that have very high risk of undercounting kids and low response rates, but also what is the racial ethnic composition of kids in those tracts. So.
And Jasmine, I'm going to ask you to just pop on for a moment and explain to people where Mark's subsequent updates will be found, how they can find them easily.
Hi everyone. Yes, so if you go to countallkids.org, under the news section, you can see all of our updated articles and blogs. Since there will be a new article weekly, you can find it there. And then within each article or blog, I will link the associated file where you can get all the data that you need. And then when you go to the Google, if you want to go straight to the Google folder, it's in the Count All Kids Google Drive, and there's a specific section for PRB materials, and it's separated by date.
So we have a question specifically about DC about whether it's possible to have the tract information broken down by wards. And I'll defer to you on that one, Mark, obviously.
I would think so. I'm not positive that tract boundaries are aligned within, fully contained within wards. We have not done that, but that's something that could be done. So, so tracts are relatively small geographic areas, so you often can place them within lots of other types of geographic areas. We were talking the other day about congressional districts, for example, might be useful to some people. And wards is another good example of geographies that people care about and are probably more meaningful than tracts in DC.
We have a question about the 7 explanatory variables that explain 50% of the variation, and they're wondering how the new mode of online response affects all of this. And Mark, I think that's clearly for you.
Yeah, I think that is currently an open question. There are certainly concerns about we all know about the digital divide, and there are a lot of potential issues in rural areas and in poorer communities in accessing the internet. So this is something that's all new for 2020. So I think that we don't have a good answer to that yet, but it could very well be that some of the variables will change for 2020 because of these new procedures, the new data collection procedures that they're using for this census.
We also have a question from Amy. Can you clarify where the second part of the legend categories is coming from, the 62%? Is that what the final self-response rate was in 2010 for the 689 counties?
Yeah, the 62% is, that is the average self-response rate across all of the tracts in our 689 large counties in our database. So it's just a little bit higher. I think that the national response rate was around 60% for that week. So it's just a little bit higher. It's very similar to the national rate.
And your colleague Linda notes that these are self-response rates, not total response rates. As I hope everybody on this webinar knows, after the self-response period is over, the Bureau goes in and knocks on doors and talks to neighbors and tries to get 100% responses. So these are all self-response rates.
Yep.
And Linda, if I've misunderstood your comment, please let us know. Debbie Griffin would like to know whether there was any minimum tract size required for you to produce a self-response rate.
Well, the self-response rate data, we just relied on what was provided by the Census Bureau at the tract level from their database. We did have for our kids living in very high-risk neighborhoods, to classify tracts, we did take out certain tracts that had fewer than 25 kids. So there wasn't very many tracts that were like that, but because these are relatively large counties, I think it wasn't too much of an issue. But we didn't do any filtering on the data from the Census Bureau for response rates.
And then Debbie Griffin has a comment, which I think is essentially the same in the chat box and the Q&A. She would love to see another statistic in the maps, specifically a color for tracts with very high risk of undercoverage of young children and horrible self-response rates, trying to show the very worst scenarios. She's saying maybe less than 50%. And I don't know if that's possible or if it's possible to do in the Excel charts.
It's a good question. We actually had a long call just a couple of days ago trying to figure out those map categories. And we were debating including more of them. So we were looking at 1 standard deviation below the mean, 2 standard deviations below the mean, which would really identify a lot more. It would enable you to really focus in on those that might have extremely low response rates. And if you have limited resources, those are probably the ones you want to focus on. But I am a little concerned that a lot of those would fall into that that update leave type category, where there's a reason why response rates are so low, just because of everything's been kind of thrown into disarray with the current situation we're in. So it's worth looking into. And it's true that our tract database does have all of the response rates in there. So you could do that filtering yourself to see, to really focus in on those particular areas.
So we're at the end. We've gone a few moments over actually, but these were important questions. I wanted to get them answered. I will note for the person who asked about DC that the tracks don't align completely with wards, but it's pretty close, and the Department of Planning could probably help align them. That's from Gina Dwyer, who's working on census response here. And there's a question about why don't we use birth record data, which is really a question for the Bureau and not for Mark. So I'm, you know, they are in fact looking at potentially adding in administrative data this year. We don't have a lot of information about what data they might use, but they're certainly struggling with how to get a complete count given the epidemic, even after the delay that they've done. If people have additional questions, please feel free to email them to me at dstein@foramericas.children.org, and we'll see if Mark can help with that. This is very much, as he said, a beta project and an ongoing project, and I know that, I should not speak for you, but I am confident that Mark wants this to be as useful for everybody as possible, and I hope you guys will all find it as exciting and powerful a tool as I do. And I'm gonna just see, I think Flo may have left us. I was gonna ask her if she wanted to close us out with a comment as a funder on all of this, but I am very excited to see how many of you joined us, and I hope that this will be useful for you. And if there are things that you would like to see that would make it more useful, please do let us know. And I will note, Mark, that somebody said, this is my first time working on the census. This is an amazing tool. So yeah. And with that, thank you so much for doing this, Mark. We look forward to working with you and getting your information out over the rest of this period. And thank you so much for doing this for kids. I think it'll make a big difference for them.
Great, thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.